So, let me see if I can get it to advance now. Ta-da. There we go. So the question I want to answer is, were Kathryn Reynolds and Lena Fitch really Kathryn and Lena Paulus? So the first thing I have to do is I have to introduce you to Bernice Windsor Rich. Bernice is my maternal grandmother. And this is obviously who I inherited this idea of being a genealogist from. Bernice was an avid family historian back in the day before genealogy became a thing. She did her research in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s, back when you actually had to write somebody a letter and hope that they would send you something back. She concentrated on two main lines. Her maiden name was Windsor, and it traces back to the original family that occupied Windsor Castle, not those people who live there now. And her mother's maiden name was Mather, and we share Richard Mather with Cotton Mather of the Salem witch trial fame. But one of her brick walls was her maternal grandmother, Kathryn Paulus Mather. In her many notes, there was a handwritten note regarding Kathryn. Let me see if I can shrink this down. When a young girl, Kathryn, her sister Lena, and a brother named unknown, Orphans, were sent to Franklinville from New York City to be kept for the summer. A family by the name of Reynolds decided to keep Kathryn, never adopted her. Lena and brother were adopted by two other families, and they moved west. They never heard from each other for years. Around 1900, Lena traced the whereabouts of Kate back to Franklinville and contacted her. Kate went to Minnesota to visit Lena. Later, Lena visited Kate in Buffalo. They never heard from the brother. Now, Kathryn, Lena, and their brother were orphan train riders. The orphan trains were organized by relief organizations in New York City, both civic and religious, that moved more than 200,000 children between 1856 and 1929 out of New York City. The record keeping was not the best, and a great deal of children were moved around the time of the Civil War. And that's where Kathryn sat for almost 50 years. So how much of Bernice's story can I prove? So you start with what you know. So I know Kathryn married Asa Mather in 1877. I know she's supposed to be living with the Reynolds family in Franklinville, New York. And we can find this family in 1875. She's listed as Kitty, age 20, father Henry, mother Harriet, and older brother Melvin. We move back 5 years and we can find the family there still in 1870 with Henry, Harriet, Melvin, and Kitty is now 14. But when we go to the 1865 census for New York State, we still see Henry, Harriet, and Melvin. But 9 or 10-year-old Kathryn is no longer there. So now we have a starting point. Kathryn has to arrive in Franklinville after the 1865 state census, but before the 1870 federal census. So if she's not in Franklinville, where is she? Well, a search of the federal census for 1860 for the state of New York, because she's coming out of New York City, for a Kathryn Paulus around the age of 4 or 5 only shows 1. In the 11th Ward, District 7 of New York City, we find a family group. Michael Paulus, age 35, is a shoemaker born in Bavaria. His wife Magdalene, daughter Mary, and son Jacob are also all born in Bavaria, but his daughter Kathryn, age 4, and a son Joseph, 6 months, are born in New York. Now, the 7th district covers the tip of Manhattan Island and part of Brooklyn. There's no other record for this family. There's no record of them in 1855, and there's no record of them in 1865. So if we use this as a theory, we're going to use this as a starting point to see if we can create a family for Kathryn. So Michael and Magdalene are her parents. She's got an older brother, Mary, and a brother, Jacob, born in Bavaria. If she's born in the US in 1856, now we have a point of immigration. And now we have a name for that unknown brother, possibly, of Joseph. So can we trace these kids out of New York City? And where's Lena? She's the only name we actually have, and she's not there. So now we're going to use Ancestry, we're going to use Ancestry DNA, and we're going to use shared matches. And any names that you see are used with permission. So we're going to use Betty Rich Gavin's DNA. Betty Rich is my mother. She is Bernice's daughter. And if you go to search, and under searches in the surname matches tree, you can put a last name. And so I put in Paulus. If you don't attach a tree to your DNA, you're not going to show up on this kind of search. And I get a match. I get a match for Terry Carl, and he's got a tree, and he's got a Jacob Paulus. Now I'm pretty excited because if you remember, Jacob was Kathryn's older brother's name on that family. So is this the right Jacob? Well, this one's born in 1845, and I'm looking for 1852. This one's parents are Jacob and Anna Maria, and I'm looking for Michael and Magdalena. So this isn't the right one. But when we go back one more generation and we look at the 1845 Jacob's father, Jacob, he had 15 children with 2 different wives. And in that mix is a son, Michael, born in 1824. And when we click on that Michael, we come back to our family group of Magdalena with children Mary, Jacob, Kathryn, and Joseph. So now we're working with the same family in New York City. So please, again, if you create a DNA account, please attach a functional tree and respond if people message you, even if it's to say you can't help. So I messaged Terry, and he agreed that the DNA seemed to make this match likely, and he had hired a German genealogist to search the family in Alsace. Would I like a copy of that report? The researcher found a marriage for Michael and Magdalena, which proved that they were Catholic, which really surprised me. Baptismal records for Mary and Jacob, and a comment that said left for America, location unknown. So now you're going to look at the shared matches within that family. Who do Terry and Betty have in common? Do they have some? Yes. Are they helpful? No. Why not? Well, there's 6 matches, but 3 don't have a tree. 1 has a locked tree, 1 has an unlinked tree, and 1 has a tree with 10 people, but when you click on it, they're all private. So that unlinked tree is the best I got. When I open him up, he's got a Michael born in 1829. Pretty vague, could be close, but he's married to Mary Kathryn Rummel, and Marianne and George are his kids. So it's the wrong wife and the wrong children. And that's where it's at for another 2 years. And then Betty got a new DNA match to a woman named Mary Head. Came up as a 3rd or 4th cousin. Now, that's pretty close. I know 4th cousins personally, but she doesn't have a searchable tree. But they have 27 shared matches. Instead of that 6, now there's 27. And those 6 that match Terry are all part of this 27 matches. So I messaged her, and I got a response from her granddaughter, Amy, who informed me that Mary is 93 years old and lives in Iowa, thought she was 100% Irish, was so upset by the 40% German that she made them do the test again. So upset that she's now convinced that she's adopted and is taking down the Irish decorations in her house. Can I help her? And I said, absolutely. So she sent me a basic tree that said Mary Riley is born in 1927 in Iowa to Leslie Merton Riley. Well, if you're gonna have a Riley as a last name, have your first name be Leslie instead of Jim. It makes it easier to search. And we can find that family in Iowa in 1930. But there's no record of the family in 1920. But Leslie states that he's born in Minnesota. So can we find him as a 19-year-old in Minnesota? And we do. Leslie Riley, age 19, living in Hennepin County, Minnesota, with his brother Eugene and his father Edward and his mother Lena. At that point, I'm pretty sure the top of my head popped off, and I will admit, I think I ran through the house screaming. Could Lena Riley be Lena Paulus? If you remember, Kathryn traveled to Minnesota around 1900 to visit her sister Lena. So that 1910 census told us that Lena was born in New York to German parents. Cool. Lena's been married for 23 years, so around 1887, and all of her sons are born in Minnesota. When we then go to the 1900 census, we see that Lena was born in May of 1862. Well, this explains why she's not in that 1860 census. She wasn't born yet. She also says that she's been married for 13 years, but her oldest son is actually 17. So this tells us that this is actually Edward's second marriage. The family is there when we go back 5 years. We go back to 1895, they're there. Now, Lena would be single in 1880. Remember, she doesn't get married until 1887, but a search for Lena Paulus in Minnesota found nothing. So can we use her son's records? Can we find death certificates or marriage certificates that list the maiden name? And we do. Harry says his parents are Edward Riley and Lena Fitch. Well, all the air went right out of my balloon. Who the heck is Lena Fitch? I'm looking for Lena Paulus. But then Grandma's note came back. The other children were adopted by two families and went west. Lena was adopted by the time she was 5. Her name is not Paulus. Her name is Lena Fitch. So in 1880, we can find Lena, a servant living in Sunrise, Minnesota, age 18, born in New York, father now born in New York, and mother in Pennsylvania. So is this a clue to the adoptive family? So a search in 1880 for Fitch, born in New York with a wife born in Pennsylvania, in Sunrise, Minnesota. We get John O. Fitch, age 51, farmer, born in New York, and his wife Lucina, age 49, born in Pennsylvania. Now, can we take them back to 1870 and put Lena back in their household? Yes, and they're in Franklinville, New York. We go right back to where they started. John O. Fitch, age 41, farmer, Lucina, 39, with a son, George, 18, and 7-year-old Lena. Now, George, that 18-year-old George, is actually John's nephew. His sister died in childbirth, and he took his nephew in. We're going to do the same thing then with the Fitches as we did with the Reynolds. We go back to 1865 to see if 2-year-old Lena is living with these parents. They're not. John is still single in 1865. He's living with his parents and his sister Harriet. So if John's single in 1865, he's not adopting a 2-year-old. So now we know he's got to have time to not only get married before he can adopt. So these kids have to get here after 1865, but before 1870. If you actually look at the 1870 census, Kathryn is number 30 out of 40 on page 6, and Lena is 14 on page 7. There's only 4 houses in between where these two girls are living. So I believe that Kathryn and Lena are 2 of those Paulus sisters. So can Lena and Kathryn lead us to the families of their siblings, Mary, Jacob, and Joseph? Remember, we now have 27 shared matches to try to put together. Well, Mary Paulus works. The oldest daughter, Mary, would not have gotten on the train. She was probably 15 or 16 years old at that point. She would have already been farmed out to be a maid or a scullery servant or something. She actually lives in Brooklyn her whole life. Her second great-granddaughter, Kaylin, is a shared match with both Mary and with Betty. And she informed me that she was married twice and had 2 children. Jacob's family is documented. I can find them in census records, but none of the children seem to ever get married. In 1900, his wife Carolyn says she had 10 children and only 4 are living. And in 1915, 3 are still single, still living at home. And in 1930, 2 of them are still single and living at home. The one daughter who does leave home says that she's widowed. She's not. She just never gets married, and apparently there's less stigma being widowed than there was being a spinster. What's interesting with Jacob, though, is we know he's probably the right one because of his occupation. He's a shoe cutter. Remember, his father was a shoemaker, and Terry Carl, his grandfather, was also a shoemaker. So this seems to be a family occupation. Jacob's census also says his birthday is November of 1851, and they immigrated in 1852. That again corresponds to that 1860 census group of him being the last one born in Germany. And then there's Joseph. He's 6 months old in 1860. He should be 10 in 1870. He's mentioned in Bernice's notes, but there is no record for anyone named Joseph between the ages of 5 and 15 in Franklinville in 1870. And if you take every single male in Franklinville that's born around that age, You can take them from 1870 back to 1865. There's nobody just hanging out. So does he die? Does he move? I don't know. My guess is that he probably died as a child. But there's still something wrong. I keep getting this second group that says that there's a Michael Paulus married to Mary Kathryn Remmel in Pennsylvania around 1875. But every single one of these people has him with no record prior to 1875. It's like he falls out of the sky. Some of them are close matches. In fact, some of them are as close as Mary and closer matches than some of Kathryn's own great-grandkids. So what really happened to Michael and Magdalena? Well, Magdalena died. We have a death certificate for her. She dies the 14th of November, 1867. So if the kids came for the summer, they would be there around the summer of 1868, which lines up perfectly with our census records. She dies in Manhattan, the only census record we have of them. They are living in that area, 42 years old, but her marital status is unknown. She's not married, she's not divorced, she's not widowed, it's unknown. So where's Michael? Well, Michael, age 41, shoemaker, enlisted in 1861 in the 3rd Volunteer New York. This is the Civil War. It was a 3-year enlistment. He was honorably discharged. The group never left New York State. He re-enlists in 1865. Now we're starting to smudge our age a little bit. We've actually lost a few years. In 1865, he joins the 75th Volunteer New York. He is mustered out the 31st of August, 1865 in Savannah, Georgia. He's part of Sherman's March to the Sea. So where is he from 1865 when he's discharged until 1875 when he appears to show up in Dauphin, Pennsylvania? How does he get home from Savannah, Georgia? Part of what the Union troops did was destroy all the railroad tracks. How did those troops get back to New York City? He's not in a census for 65, 70, or 75. There's no mention of him in a Pennsylvania paper until 1953 when his son dies, and there's no mention of him at all in a New York paper. But if you look at the DNA, this is my tree. This is Michael and Magdalene, and there are 13 DNA matches that I can trace down from those children. When I look at this other family of Michael with Mary Kathryn Remmel, I still get another 13 DNA matches, and some of these are higher matches than the ones that are to my actual family. So there's always more questions that need to be answered. Where is Michael? Why didn't he go home? Or does he get home and by the time he gets there, his wife has died and his children have been shipped out? Did Magdalena die and the children were then orphans? Or did she become destitute and have to put them in the orphanage when her husband failed to return from Georgia? What happened to Joseph? He's in the 1860 census and he's in Bernice's notes, but there's no paper trail for him and there's no DNA lead. Does he die as a child? One of the questions that needs to be answered is a letter that was included in Bernice's notes. Kathryn's daughter-in-law, Beatrice Mather, wrote a letter to Bernice regarding a conversation that she had with her father-in-law, Asa Mather, after Kathryn's death. Now, Bernice's father, William Windsor, died when she was 6. Her mother, Lena, remarried Eugene Taylor. Eugene was previously married. He had a daughter, Beatrice. Beatrice then married Joe Mather, Lena's younger brother. So this made Beatrice Taylor Mather Bernice's stepsister because Bernice's mother married Beatrice's father, and Bernice's aunt because Beatrice was married to Joseph Mather, her mother's brother. In the letter, Beatrice writes, yes, Reynolds was the name of the family that adopted Joe's mother or lived with. Their name was Paulus, meaning Kathryn, and Joe's father told me it was Joe's name, but Joe says it isn't. I believe it is, as Joe said the family was supposed to have money in Alsace-Lorraine and thought they might trace him. Stands to reason it was Paulus. Now, why would Asa Mather tell his daughter-in-law that his son was not his son without ever telling his son that he's not his son? So we have to look at these kids. The 2 youngest Mather children are Clarence and Joseph. Clarence is born July 1895. Joe is born May 1897. But when you look at the 1900 census, they should be 3 and 5, and they're not there. Kate states she has 7 children, 5 are living. Oldest daughter Bessie's already married. Second daughter Lena is already married. Henry's 15. He had a twin, Harry, who died at birth. Harold is 11. There's a girl named Clara. This is the only census this child appears on. She's not there in 1892. She's there in 1900, and she's not there again in 1905. So Kate is a foster child. Did she take in somebody who was only there for a little while? They had a set of unnamed twins after Harold. So that's 3 kids dying, 7 born, 5 living. That still does not account for where are Clarence and Joseph. In the original note, Bernice actually crossed out when 2 of Kate's sons were partly grown up, when she talks about her going to Minnesota. So instead, could Kate have brought these boys back from Minnesota with her? Were they her sister's family? Well, that was always my theory until finding out that Lena was a Fitch rather than a Paulus. But could the boys be related to her brother, whose name was also Joseph? But there are no Pauluses in Minnesota in 1895 or 1900. There is in 1905, but they're a family that immigrates in 1903. If you look at Forest Lawn Cemetery, the family is all together in 2 adjoining plots, except for Joseph. He's buried in Pennsylvania. But I would go there and I'm like, well, I can't find Clarence. I don't know where Clarence is buried, until I got the plot maps and found out Clarence is buried with the rest of the family, but he's the only one that doesn't have a stone. Why didn't his father get him a stone? He dies 3 years before his father. Why is he the only one that didn't get a rather large monument? So we have to add that to our list. Are Clarence and Joseph Mather actually Clarence and Joseph Paulus? Did they leave us a family to find out? Well, Joseph only had 1 daughter, and she died as a child. Clarence had 1 son, Harold. Harold had 2 sons, Harold C., who died in 2014, never married, no children, and Michael. The only record of Michael is his brother's obituary. There's no other record of Michael. He's not in the paper, there's no addresses, there's no directories, there's nothing. So I'm not really sure who Michael is. But what it would prove is, if we could do a DNA on Michael and see if he connects, he would be at least from one of the Pauluses. But if we could do a Y DNA from him and one of the Y DNAs from one of the male descendants of Michael, we could see if he actually tracks through a male ancestor. So as I look at the pictures of these kids, I can see some similarities. It's hard to tell because of the variations in the ages, but Mary, Kathryn, and Lena are full sisters. Michael is their half brother, and I actually see similarities between Mary and Michael. So Kathryn and Lena arrive in Franklinville between 1867 and 1870, along with a brother, Joseph. Kathryn remains in Franklinville and adopts the Reynolds name, whether she's legally adopted or not, while Lena is adopted by the Fitch family and ends up in Minnesota. Joe's location remains unknown. Older sister Mary and older brother Jacob remained in the New York City area. They were too old to ride the train. But DNA has linked the girls' families as well as family number 2. That leads to the conclusion that Michael Paulus had a second family, either after finding his gone in New York City or when he never returned home from the Civil War. Thank you.